encounter and to develop a comprehensive view of the competitive landscape. A few, you might call it housekeeping notes up front. We are recording this session, so for people that have to drop in and out or potentially come in a little bit later, we will provide this recording in the future, as well as we will follow up with the presentation afterwards so that you have it for your reference. Since it's a bit of a smaller group today, we'd like to keep it a little more informal than a strictly one-way presentation, so to speak. So if you do have questions using the GoToWebinar control panel, you can type them, or if you feel like asking a question verbally, please do so. So we'd like to keep this a little more discussion-oriented. That said, we have provided time at the end of the session for formal questions. So a little bit about today's presenter, and then I want to hand it over to Dan. We've been very excited to have Dan join our team and build a practice around competitive wargaming and other consulting offerings. Really help to round out and strengthen our core offerings as a market research and analytics company. And Dan has applied the competitive wargaming model that he's developed in a number of different settings across a number of different categories. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the session over to Dan Heapy, and away we go.
Thank you, Corey, and good morning to those in the US, and good afternoon to those in Europe, and good evening to those in Asia. So as Corey says, my name is Dan Heapy, and I'm going to take you through a session around competitive wargaming, I guess overall competitive strategy. Obviously you saw the email come out, and competitive wargaming is something we've all done numerous times. I mean, my background is marketing from the very beginning, largely in healthcare and consumer. So my background is with GSK to start with, moved around to AstraZeneca, and then showing Plough and Merck, so a variety of different companies. And the last 5 years I've spent in strategic consultancy, delivering numerous war games, probably well over 100 in that time, and of course within the pharmaceutical companies which I was in, also had several experiences of competitive war games from the other side, if you like. So a wealth of experience understanding the different types of war games, and therefore can understand the types of things that can go wrong. And I think we've all been there, where we come out of a day or a 2-day session where things haven't really got anywhere near where we wanted to go. But you've probably also been in sessions where things have gone fantastically well, and you get to the end and you're energized and you think, wow, we can really go and beat the competition. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, the things that you need to watch out for, the things that really make these things work, but also where they fit, because war games on their own are a great exercise, but really it sits in an overall umbrella of competitive strategy. So I'll just start soon, but I'm sure you've all done with webcam before, and obviously the webcam's at the top of the computer, my slides are further down, so if you see my eyes going up and down like this, I'm just trying to make sure I'm on the right part of the slide. So as I've said, using wargaming to develop an effective competitive strategy. Now, even this slide is important in its own right about wargaming. One of the things that people often overlook, people get very excited about the event, the 1 or 2 day session with the wider team, but forget that actually the wargaming event should form part of a wider competitive strategy approach. It should form part of the whole insight gathering around competitors that you're embarking on over a 12-month planned period. So I think important point number one almost is wargaming is a great tool, and we'll come on to what it really can do, but it should sit alongside a much larger, broader scope of competitive strategy. So you saw this in the email we sent to you. Now, I'll very much stick to this one. And again, as Corey said, please interact with questions or comments as we go through. But competitive wargaming can be fantastically successful, but can really be quite harmful if it's done incorrectly. I think it's a great process. The meetings can be very, very energizing, which is great. But the challenge is, what is the output? What is the output of the session that you're really trying to drive? And so often I've sat in these sessions where ultimately the output is a list of defense mitigating strategies against the competition. So maybe the war game was to understand what a new launch competitor was going to do. What's that competitor going to do in the market? How's it all going to interact with everything else? And then we're going to put a defense plan against that competitor. And because it's all new, it's the competitor's launching in 4 months' time, everybody gets quite excited about it. Now the challenge there, and this is where I think competitive war games really have their limitation and where we need to watch out, is if all the war game does is deliver a defense plan and people are energized behind it, that people will go and deliver that fantastically well. Now that sounds great. The problem, of course, is that you, sometime before that meeting, you developed a strategy and a plan. And that's the plan that drives your brand forward, not necessarily the mitigation against a new launch. So this is the major watch out with competitive war games, is they're not really designed, well, they're not best used to build competitive defense plans or counter strategies. They really should be used to pressure test the plans that you already have in place. So, should you stay away from competitive war games? My answer, having delivered, say well over 100 of these, is absolutely not. They are a great tool to really help understand the competitive insights that you have. And those strategies and implementation plans developed during the competitive war game are invaluable, but they should be considered in the wider picture of your overall plan. So I'm not here today to say that war games aren't good. What I'm saying is actually they're a fantastic tool. Just be wary of how you use them. So as I say, the main purpose of the war game is pressure testing strategy, and understanding the way the market is going to change and evolve, and then thinking, okay, given all of that information that we've got, does our strategy still hold? And I think that's probably the most important thing I'll say today, and I'll probably say it a few times. The challenge, of course, is how to set these up, how to make them work in a way that you can actually understand all the complex environment and get some crystallized insights that you can actually make decisions from. And I think that's another part of competitive war games. Excuse me. I think that's another part of competitive wargaming, which is one of the things to get right, and we'll come on to it later on, is the preparation in terms of understanding the insights that need to go through. So a quick summary of wargaming as we are right now. It absolutely is an integral part in developing the overall competitive strategy. But this bottom point, I think, is where wargaming really comes into its own. We've approached some of the pitfalls of wargaming in terms of those competitive defense plans, and we're almost coming too focused on mitigating against what the competitors are doing. But I think what wargaming really is great for is turning those into the bottom point here, those raw insights into meaningful market understanding and foresight. And I think that is what it's all about. And that is ultimately, when we come back to the whole competitive strategy, you're developing insights. You may have competitive intelligence coming in all the way through the year, and those insights keep generating new thoughts, new assumptions. But ultimately, the competitive war game at its heart is about reviewing the assumptions that you initially had when you put your strategic plan together, pulling all the new insights together and understanding if this is what this competitor A is going to do and this is what competitor B is going to do, how are they going to interact, how will they respond to each other, and how will that affect the market moving forward? And if you can start to understand the way the market will move and how these competitors will change the market, then that really is then starting to say, well, now we understand, we have foresight. We have an understanding of the market is going to do this, then it's going to do this, and then it's going to do this. And only then can you really go back and say, okay, new insight and understanding, what is our strategy? Is it right? Is it wrong? And I think that's the most important part for me about what war games can do, is that translation of the raw insight into something meaningful to actually make some valid decisions. So I'll quickly pause there in terms of I saw some questions come through. So I just want to pause at that initial phase before moving on to some of the solutions about how to do it and see whether there's any thoughts or questions from the audience. I shall take silence at this stage to say not yet. So keep thinking of questions as we go through. But obviously where we've got to so far is very much an understanding of what you can and can't do with war games. But I think ultimately, and please challenge me on this. my experience demonstrates that actually war games are focused on one goal, and that is predicting the future competitive landscape. And it's that predictive nature of the war game. If you can get the design right, the focus right, and the right people in the room, that really makes them so rewarding. When you're starting to sort of interact with different competitors and start to understand, the reasons why they're acting the way they are, really helps you to say, well, if this is the way they behave, then in 2016, 2017, when this happens or this happens, this is what they're going to do. And you can start to predict the way the market will move, and that becomes very exciting. And I think that is really where wargaming should be focused in their first, the first part of any wargame should really be focused on this. And of course, the other factor that wargames can bring in, especially in situations where the understanding about competitors is difficult, or new trials are coming out, or new competitors are coming out, and we're not quite sure of the regulatory environment or the outcomes of those trials, or the certain big events in the market, then again, wargaming can add the level of complexity to that and start to think about scenarios. And we can start to then build different pictures, different views of the world to say, well, actually, our view currently is that the world will go in this direction. That's our core view, that's our baseline view. But what about if the data said this, or what about if this new product did this, or this new innovation came into the market? What would happen in those different situations? And again, if the mindset is right and the process is right, you can start to think about how those other aspects will interact with the market and how things will change. And then you can start to build up different scenarios, different foresights, but of course then you can sort of understand where your core plan will be, but also start to develop some contingency plans based on, again, that foresight that you're bringing. And I think, again, this is where the competitive war game really comes into its own, is that ability to take the insights, the raw learning that we have and turn it into something meaningful. But, and again, this is another sort of warning, how often do you do a session, any meeting, where you try to do too much? You have goals which are almost, it's going to take a week or 2 weeks to achieve. And I think talking about what we're talking about here in terms of scenario building and contingency planning sound great. But if you want to try and do this in a one-day session, it's just not going to be feasible. So again, I think realism needs to come into the discussion to understand how much time you have, the type of people you have, to make sure that ultimately what you're aiming to do in the time that you have is achievable. Because the most important thing about any session, any workshop, any process is that you deliver, deliver a specific objective, and you do it really, really well. That way, anybody that's been party to that process will walk away, energized and actually deliver on the outputs. So let's get into a little bit about what it is we do and how to do it. And this is obviously Optimal Strategics Group's approach and guiding principles to competitive strategy and wargaming, to give a sense of, it's all very good, Dan. Yeah, I can see scenario planning, contingency planning, future predictions, all sounds great, but how do we actually do it in practice? So I think the first thing about it is, let's not get to the meeting. There are certain things that need to happen to make the process work. And the first part of this very much is rubbish in, rubbish out. You need to provide your teams with the most relevant insights. Now, you probably have these, and I think this is probably where the expertise of people that have run these for numerous times comes in, because the amount of insights you have on competitors can be really, really big. The challenge is to understand what's key to really driving the decisions that you need to make. And I've recently run a series of war games for a company, and interestingly, although the war games themselves went fantastically well, it was the background as beforehand that really they really looked at and went, we never even thought of doing anything like this. We would have sent out 3 or 4 research decks for people to review, and of course most people then don't read them. They never thought about consolidating all that information and getting a sense of the company, the competitor company, as well as the products. In my view, the competitor company is just as important as the products. I think we can all think of situations where if you took a product and gave it to a Pfizer or a Sun Pharma from India, or let's take Merck, because that's an absolute example. Merck sold a product recently to to Sun Pharma, the way in which that product would have hit the market, the way in which it would have been promoted, the way in which it would have been perceived by customers would have been completely different. Had one company launched that product or another. And I think that's why the company is so important. The way the company behaves, the way it deals with products, the situation it's in financially, all dictates the way that product is going to get marketed. And so for me, this initial insight around the company is hugely important, alongside, of course, details on the product and anything else you can pull together. So for me, the preparation is fundamental to making sure that the wargame itself is successful. The second thing, and it sounds obvious, but I'm not sure how many times you've maybe commissioned somebody to come in and help run one of these sessions, and you think that's just something I've seen before. You know, your challenge, your questions are all unique. Your therapy areas or your areas in which you're focusing are all different. And I think, therefore, every session needs to be designed with your specific needs in mind. And that, yes, that means pulling out some core elements, but there really needs to be some solid thinking into how do we get the most out of your particular question that you need to answer, your particular team, and the experiences and the experience and expertise that they have. And finally, you know, your job in that meeting is to think and discuss and to be part of the process. And I think, therefore, what you need to have in the room are people that are able to challenge you and to give you, and to make you think differently. These sessions bring together 15, 20, 30 people into one place, the best brains in your business, to start thinking about the future competitive landscape. And what you want to be able to do is for everybody to engage fully, and that needs the right process, but it also needs the right people to be able to challenge as you go through. And to me, they are the three most important components to get right as part of a wargaming process. And then within the session itself, there are sort of three components once you get there into the wargame. And again, they may sound very obvious, but I think the most important thing about this presentation, if nothing else, is the focus on the key things. And you can sort of see here that the three key points, as I would pull them out: developing accurate and robust assumptions about how your competitors will approach the market. Now, that can take a long time, but the most important thing here is you've got the right information being put in, so people are making their informed decision based on all the market information that's out there. But then, therefore, the assumptions that are made about the competition will be accurate. I said, having run numerous of these, what we find when we look back retrospectively is that probably 80 to 90% of the predictions that we make at the time are correct. And that's a hugely powerful number when you consider how difficult it is to predict the future. But actually, by getting your head into it and making sure that the steps are followed, you really can have the confidence that what happens in those war games is really going to be predictive and really will be the majority of the future mapped out for you. The second part, once you've identified what the competitors are going to do, is then to understand what does it all mean? What are the implications of competitor A doing something on the market and on us? So what does it all mean? And I think this is where that translation of that future foresight and insight about how the market will move starts to become much more real. And you start to build, where are the key issues for us? If this competitor is going to do this and the market's moving this way, then maybe we need to be thinking more about market share than market development at the moment. And this is where I think the most meaningful bit comes out. And then the third point doesn't say, and then develop competitor mitigating plans or plans. It says, refine your brand strategy. So look at the brand that you have and the direction that you're moving it and the way in which you want to grow. And then understand whether those new forecasts about the future and the competitive landscape and the implications of that mean that you need to do anything about your approach, your proactive push for gaining growth. When it comes back to that again, it's all about it's about assessing and pressure testing what you're already doing, rather than going into the room and trying to develop more plans to mitigate against competition. So how do we pull all this together? So OSG's wargaming process, and it is iterative, and I think this is the one time I will, sorry about that, this is the one time I will talk about the overall process and not just wargaming and where it all fits together. So firstly, it's about understanding what you need to know. and what are the key things you need to identify through the process. Because obviously the insight that you already have will tell you some things and will be able to build your assumptions about maybe the clinical data of products, or maybe the regulatory time frame of products, or the launch sequence of in a different market. But what it won't be able to tell you is what a company is going to do. So what are the things that specifically the war game needs to answer? What is it you don't know that you need to know to be able to make a decision as to whether your strategy is correct? Now, again, it may sound really, really simple, but again, how many times have you got to the end of the meeting and gone, was that a good meeting? It felt good, but I'm not quite sure we got anywhere. Did we really achieve our objectives? So setting an understanding about what the insights that you need to understand are at the beginning is hugely important. Then is running the session itself. So going through the process we've said, understanding that meaningful market predictions using the competitive wargame techniques that we've begun to discuss, and then pressure testing your plans and making sure that they're right. And what, interestingly, I mean, again, you'll have been through many of these, what I find is 80%, 90% of the time you go through a wargaming process, the plan is correct. What often happens, however, is that people come up with new ideas for a tactic or two to sort of say, well, actually, we probably need to do more of this and maybe a little bit less of this. And I think that's what really changes. It really focuses people on what's important given the changing environment. And then point 4, and I think this is the importance about competitive wargaming. You can't get your team together every 3 months to redo this. So you need an ongoing iterative process that constantly tests the assumptions that have been developed through this process. So out of each wargame, you should have a list of assumptions, a list of those predictions that you identified. And then you should set up some ongoing research and analysis to make sure that you continually assess whether those assumptions that you've made are still valid. And as each one changes, so for example, a launch date changes, or some regulatory environment changes, or the competitors don't focus on this message or this message, they reduce their sales force size, or whatever it might be, whatever that change is, you can assess your assumptions, and then most importantly, do a quick check to say, okay, so a competitor sales force size is halved. Does that mean we do anything different, yes or no? So you have an iterative, ongoing, built-in process that allows you to filter the research, but again, continually just pressure test the plan as you go along. So you don't have to continually repeat this process. And again, that's the bit I think that most companies will miss. They'll run a war game, they'll go away, they'll implement, 6 months later, they'll come back and go, things have changed, they'll run another war game, and that's not what you need to do. You can continually iterate this process and make sure that you've got those insights coming in, that pressure test, or I guess review the assumptions that you've made to make sure that your plan is still valid against those market predictions that you had. So step 4 is the one that most people miss, and I think is the thing I recommend focusing on in terms of competitive strategy as a whole. So moving on to my sort of penultimate slide, if you like, in terms of what I want to present, I wanted to give you some summaries of the kind of outputs that you could get from the wargaming approach if you went through it. So again, it comes back to those three simple steps that I went through before. Developing the accurate, robust assumptions, identifying the implications, and then refining the brand strategy. So if we go through those now, example 1 here, the assumption in the marketplace, given all the process that we've been through, is that competitor A will lower its price by 20% on the launch of biosimilars. So that's the assumption we've got. So if the branded competitor lowers its price, what does that mean? And that's the translation. I think that's the benefit and the real value of wargaming is how you translate it. So for biosimilars to gain share, it is likely that they're going to have to keep lowering their price, and then the branded product may lower its price. And of course, we've seen something like this in the immunology market over the past few years, where biosimilars have come in and Merck MSD have lowered their price to try and match, and obviously the only way for the biosimilars to gain more share is to keep lowering their price, and you end up with a constant price battle to try and maintain share. The implication to us as another branded product is that the naive patient share, that new share, is likely to become much more competitive, with payers pushing harder and harder for the cheaper products to get used. So what it means for us is that gaining new share in the market is going to become much, much more difficult. Therefore, do we need to relook at our strategy around different methods or different messages that might help in that naive patient group? So in this instance, the importance of additional efficacy in naive patients that it has on the long-term outcome. So do we need to refocus and say it's not just about efficacy and safety, it's about a specific part of our product that says that we are slightly better in efficacy, which means it has a much better outcome in the long term, that tries to mitigate against some of those price points. What it may also be, and I've worked on products like this quite recently in this situation, is we need to maybe move away from naive share and stop and reduce our market growth activities and start to think about how we hold on to the patients we've already got and try different strategies in that way. So, but again, it's all about understanding the future prediction and understanding the implications correctly to then critique your strategy and say, where does it need to change? Final example here, and again, before I then throw the questions out again, for people to give an opportunity to ask questions. Competitor B, a new class of therapy, will not show an efficacy benefit over the standard of care, the same class as our product. So, but competitor B will use its novel mode of action as its key differentiator. So we know it's not going to be any better, but it's a new way of doing things. I mean, how often is this the case that a new product comes into your market? It doesn't really have too much differentiation, but it finds something that it tries to, make it stand for and put its positioning in the market. But uptake of competitor B will be slow and reserved for treatment failures and not naive patients in year one. So that's the assumption for us, is that we expect it to come in with the same efficacy. That's an assumption. We don't know that because it's not launched yet. We therefore assume that it will use its mode of action as its key differentiator, and therefore we assume that physicians will reserve it for second, third line therapy, and therefore the impact on our naive share is going to be minimal. Therefore, right now, based on this list of assumptions, there's no impact on current strategy. Now, going back, and my final point before opening to questions is point 4. If that's your assumption, that nothing's going to change based on these three, this level of these 3 points, you can monitor that, because should the efficacy change in the trials and actually deliver something better than we thought, then all of a sudden this flow changes. And what you don't want to have to do is to go back to a whole war game to decide the impact of that. But if you've got these flows set out and these assumptions set out, you can quickly go back, review it, say absolutely, okay, the efficacy is slightly better. Now they're going to go in with an efficacy and mode of action message together. Does that mean they're going to get naive share now? Yes or no? If so, where and who? And then does that impact on strategy? So hopefully you can start to see the importance of the wargaming, pulling this together in the first instance, but then the iterative process to pressure test and make sure that these assumptions stay correct as we move through. So again, I will hold there and wait for questions. In terms of my presentation, just so you know, I've got one more summary slide to show you. So I've tried to give you an overview of the pitfalls, but hopefully towards the end, giving a summary of the things that if you really focus on and get right, you will have a fantastic wargaming process. So please, any questions that you have? And are there any written down, Corey? I'm not sure whether any were typed out as we went through.
Not that I've seen, Dan, but I think maybe at this point, I know that you and I have discussed some of the issues that come up when we're putting together, or you and your team are putting together war games, specifically issues like what are some of the techniques you can use to develop the best foresight for the future market, as well as localizing outputs. A lot of the companies that we deal with are global and deal with different territories, and so then finally what's the right cadence for reassessing your competitive strategy, and how do you make sure that you're driving that reassessment, that it doesn't simply lose its steam and stop. So maybe you could talk through some of those issues. So I know that those are ones that tend to come up fairly regularly.
Yeah, no, good point.
Actually, Dan, I'm sorry to pause, but we do have a question from one of our attendees. What do you mean by naive share when you're talking about that? I think a question of terminology.
That's my fault. So ultimately, that's patients that haven't yet experienced your product, whatever that might be. So it's patients that are that haven't yet had your product before, so they're naive. So they're, basically what it means is they're new to therapy or new to your product class. That's what it means. So
got it.
I guess when you're thinking in pharmaceuticals, which is where this was based, it's the patients that haven't yet either had a therapy at all or had a therapy out of your class. So it's the first line therapy, if you like. That's what we're talking about when we talk naive.
Great, thanks, Dan. So yeah, if you don't mind, if we could talk through a few of those issues, I think that would be I think it would be great. Some common things that come up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the cadence was one. So how often should you do this? That's a pretty important question, and I think often they're done too much because realistically they're expensive, they're difficult to pull together with all the people, and when they're done too much, they lose their effectiveness. So what is too much and what is too little? Now, an ideal way of pulling these war games together is to align it to your planning process, because ultimately, again, going back to the fundamentals of what a war game is, it's pulling together and collating all the insights that you have into meaningful future predictions about the competitive landscape and the market environment. And when do you really need to know that? Ideally, when you're deciding and reassessing your strategy. So the best time for a war game, in my view, is as part of your situational analysis development for your brand plan. So that's when I would do it. I would make time to have a day or a 2-day session of wargaming as part of understanding the situation analysis for your area before then developing your strategy or revising your strategy. So that's where I think it will fit best. How often? Once a year would be plenty. Most important thing about that, if you don't do step 4 and constantly reassess the assumptions that you've made and make sure that or have a process in place for reassessing those assumptions and making sure, as I've said here in example 2, if the efficacy were to change, then does that impact on the strategy? As long as you've got this monitoring system in place, then actually you can have the confidence that once a year is enough. And I think that means that each time you do it, you'll have a great meeting and you'll be able to get the outputs that you need. So that's how I'd pull them together.
Okay.
The other point,
Dan, sorry to interrupt you. We do have another question that came in regarding the example that you used about biosimilars, and I think the question was about, it's very specific, and how can wargaming be applied if you consider a more complex setting of a company that's active in various markets with different dynamics and competitors. So I think if you have an example of where there's a more complex setting that you've done it in, that probably would answer our question.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's a good question. I mean, obviously, if you're doing this in a country, then it becomes more straightforward because you've got to select a certain set of competitors, and obviously generally the market is homogeneous and it's the same. However, the majority of sessions like this that I run are global, and some of them are regional. So the question is, how do you make them practical and relevant given that experience? So I'll work on my most recent experience was a couple of weeks ago in a regional session where you had countries from 15, 16 different countries represented. And they all had different competitive challenges. Some countries didn't even have some of the competitors, and other ones had competitors that were 20% market share in one country and it was 2% market share in another. And I think that's the reality of environments and markets that we have now, especially with the market access situations that we have. It's obviously sometimes down to payers as to who gets what. So what do you do in those situations? Well, the key thing really is to understand each individual country before we start and allocate groups. Now, the way in which the process can run, and it can run in several different ways, but a core process is to role play the competitors. So if you've got a country where a competitor is 20% of the market, and that's a high market share, you want to make sure though that country is role playing that competitor. But obviously, if a certain country doesn't have that competitor as part of its competitive mix, they can sit somewhere else. So actually I think that's one way to make sure that the teams that you pull together are aligned to the process and aligned to the countries that they have. Interestingly, as you go through, a lot of the actions and a lot of the things that the competitors will do are quite similar and start to pull together. So what also happens as you go through and you start to discuss the impact on the wider regional market, people start to learn about what the other companies are doing that maybe aren't even operating in their country, and that really helps them understand, potentially other ideas about what their own local environment will be. I think the most important thing, though, as you go through this, is then what happens after that. The insights that you generated, the future foresight that you generated, is then all very interesting. But as you say, from a regional or global perspective, it's not specific enough to then make tactical plans in local markets. So what we'd always recommend, and again, this is what's happened post the meeting around 2 weeks ago, is that in select countries, they're running their own session off the back of the one they attended as a region, to take the learnings and to work with it. If we go back, and this is getting quite specific now, but if we go back here and talk about the rubbish in, rubbish out, those background documents that really help people understand the company and the products, they can be reused in local environments. There's not too much that changes often from the product perspective or even the company perspective in local areas. So you can reuse those. You can reuse a lot of the slides because the challenges will be the same, and allow the local countries to go through the same process. Obviously, that's a lot more useful, and obviously then you can start to think about pressure testing local strategy as well as sort of regional or global strategy. So I think there are things that you can do, but ultimately the competitive challenges that people face are quite similar.
Dan?
Yeah.
Thank you for that robust answer and texture. I think that was a great insight into how you can ensure that those pieces are together. Which actually dovetails very nicely into another question that we have from an attendee about team confidence. And the direct question is, what is the best approach to increase the team's confidence in the initial assumptions? So our attendee has said, things like using external research to add credibility, or spending more in time internally to discuss and decide. So, in short, how do you make sure that everyone's on board and is supporting the initial assumptions that you're making in the wargame?
Yeah, it's a great question. I suppose that there's two parts to that. The first part is making sure what you give them up front is correct. I always think that if you can set the process up in the right way, people start to believe in it. So by having documents at the beginning, these backgrounders that people read first, and making them feel really quite polished in terms of their output, people then start to think, actually, the information that I'm getting before I go into this meeting is absolutely first rate. It's everything I need, and it's nothing more, but it just looks as though it's professional. And again, it just means that people will read it, for one, which means that everyone comes into the war game with the right mindset. But it also starts that process of people thinking that, well, I'm going in here with all I can possibly have. And I think that's the most important thing for me, is if you know you've got all the information at your fingertips going into the meeting, when you make those decisions later on about the predictions for the future, then you've got to be more confident. So it comes back to the preparation for me. If you make sure that what's given to the team beforehand is robust and it feels as though it's had a lot of care taken on it, people will instinctively feel, yes, I think this is all I can possibly know about this topic. So when they're making their decisions, they're confident in making it off a full background of information. And that is one of the most important things. The second thing, of course, is the people in the room. If you're going to interpret some of these insights and start to predict what's going to happen, if you've got the right people in the room, that will also inspire confidence and instill confidence in others. If you're missing,
Dan, if you don't mind, can you build on that, the idea of the people in the room, based on a question that we just received about, who do you invite to the war game? That seems to be a very important component. What's your recommendation on that?
Yeah, no, good question. So again, it's all about the confidence. It does come back to a degree, to the ultimate question that you're trying to answer. So what is it that you're trying to do? I'm just skipping through a few slides here, but ultimately, section 1. Once you've identified what it is that you need to know about the competitors that you don't already know, that should help you inform to some degree who should go. However, the people that you need there are people from the marketing teams, whatever that may be, global brand leads, global brand managers or local brand managers or whatever, but marketing teams, market research teams that have the insight. And then you're also going to need, because the medical environment is so important in the clinical environment, you're going to need medical teams. Chances are, if you've got a situation where products are launching or new trials are coming out, regulatory teams are also very important to try and understand, how that's going to play out. I'd say in terms of the core teams, they are the ones that you really will struggle to do without. But I think outside of that, you've got market access. Absolutely, it depends on the product. You're going to need to understand the access environment for some of these products. So absolutely getting some of those guys along. But it does depend on part one. But I think what we've spoken about there as a core group, the key really is to have a good number of people as part of the group. An ideal number for me is between 20 and 30, if you can get that many, especially from a regional global level. So you can have people across different functions. So when you need the expertise, you can bring it in. But at the same time, you can get the buzz in the room. You're making sure you've got absolutely everybody you need from all the different functions. Again, coming back to the previous question, to have the confidence that in the predictions that you're making.
Right. A couple more, Dan. One concerning the nature of the strategy in terms of general versus specific, and I think what we're talking about here is the outcome. In other words, are you looking for, at the end of the war game, I guess, how deep do you go in terms of the tactics, or are you looking at an overall strategic plan that then the local territories or different disciplines can then apply their own set of tactics towards?
Yeah, no, again, a good question. Where do you stop? And I think this all comes back to the process. Ultimately, you need to go from insight gathering all the way through to tactical planning. But the war game doesn't have to deliver all of this. I think that's the overall planning process. So it depends a little bit on time and where you can go. My view on this one is if you're running a global or regional session, then you should stop at the point that you've started to think about some tactics. You maybe started to put some ideas together for tactical thoughts. So maybe an hour at the end of a day or two session on tactics is plenty if you're doing it at a global regional level, because putting tactics together in those sessions can be quite a challenge. So what you really want to do there is to make sure that the strategy's right, that the direction's right, that the focus areas are right, and that you've sort of started to think about some tactical theme. If you're doing this in a local country, I'd structure it quite different, in that you probably have maybe 30% of your time actually trying to develop the specific tactics, whereas in a global regional meeting you maybe only have 5 to 10% of the time. So I think it depends where you are. If you're much more local, I think you need to focus much more on the tactics because it's all about implementation. If you're more global, then actually it's about thinking about the strategic direction. So it's probably it varies as the type of group you have.
Excellent. Thank you for your answer, Dan. And then final question, and then why don't we see if we have any more? How long? Okay, a couple more. Well, we're getting a couple more questions here. How long does it usually take to prepare for a war game? And then as the second question, and I can certainly prompt you, do you invite customers, as an example, physicians, into the war game, or do you keep it strictly internal?
There we go. That's a good question. So, how does it take to prepare? How long is a piece of string? Is the analogy on that? You work your way back from the actual session itself, the war game itself. An ideal process, and let's be honest, we never all work in ideals, is that a week before the meeting, you'll send out those background documents. So that gives people time. I mean, let's be realistic. If it's a global session, most people are going to read it on the plane on the way in. But it gives everybody their opportunity to read it in the time they want to read it in. So a week before you send the backgrounders, and then ideally you want to have at least 2 weeks to develop those backgrounders, to make sure that you're pulling on all the information, all the research that's been done, all the secondary sources. We've investigated everything, but essentially what you're doing for those backgrounders is pulling together hundreds and hundreds of pages of research and the whole of the internet, the information on the internet, into something which is a 20-page document, so that people can read it in 15 to 20 minutes and get a feel of the company and product. So I would say, comfortably, and this doesn't sound that very long, but comfortably 3 or 4 weeks from start to meeting is a comfortable time to be able to deliver it. Of course, you don't always have that time, and I've done these within a week and a half. It really does sort of depend, but it's the backgrounders that take the time. So they're the rate limiting step. The agenda and the process itself can be done as that's moving forward. So 3 or 4 weeks to that. Corey, can you just remind me of the second question that you had? Hi, Corey.
Sorry about that, just figuring out the mute button on the control panel. Do you invite physicians, or, in this case, I think in the example you used, physicians would be the, the customer for the wargame. So do you invite customers into the wargame?
Yeah, no, good question. So, or payers or whoever. The answer is, my answer to that is not into an internal wargame, because the internal wargame needs to have internal thoughts. However, I have run processes whereby there's been an ad board or a session with physicians or payers first, so it's almost to develop further insight. I mean, the objective of having physicians there really is to gain further insights into the competitors and to gain their predictions. But realistically, it's the internal view that you've got to stick with. So what I'd recommend in this instance, and it does work really well, is running a sort of competitor session with customers and do that first, pull all the insights out of that, and that then can feed into the backgrounders that then feed into the internal workshop. But my view is you can't make real proper strategic decisions with customers in the room unless they're really aligned to your product. So I'd separate them out. But actually, absolutely yes. I mean, but realistically, what is that process for? What is the purpose of bringing the customers in? It's another vehicle for developing insight. So the question really would be, coming back to this slide here, do we have the information we need in-house if we pulled it all together from the research that we have? If we don't, then either we need to go and commission more research or bring customers in to help us get it. But I would generally separate customers from that internal decision making. Struggling with that mute button.
Got it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dan. Pardon me. I think that brings us up to time on our session. So unless there are any further questions, I think we can close our session. And first of all, Dan, I'd like to thank you very much for a highly informative and stimulating session. And I would like to thank our attendees for taking the time today to learn about how competitive wargaming can lead to a thoroughly pressure-tested competitive strategy. And we will make the presentation available to you for your reference. And we would be happy to we will be sending out an email with a link to that, and you can then email back to Dan with any questions or further discussion that you'd like to have about competitive wargaming. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.